You will now be placed into the conference.
Is Spss and how you might access it in various ways. So both as a researcher or potential researcher, and also as someone who's at a center and might have access to the center-specific data. And we'll have 3 people speak today, and I'll introduce them actually now, I think is probably the best way to do it. So the first speaker today will be Emily Martineau. So Emily is actually Emily is a registered nurse, and her major experience is in pediatric oncology, and she works as a Spss data manager since 2011 in Quebec City at the Children's Hospital of Quebec. And she's been on the management committee actually since 2015 and as the CRA representative and one of our trainers actually for the CRAs across Canada. So Emily will be speaking shortly about the database itself and the data elements that are collected and available for use. The next speaker will be Stephanie Bador. So Stephanie has been working at BC Children's Hospital for 9 years versus a CRA, and now is the Children's Oncology Group Lead. She compiles various clinical and research statistics for the program at the University of BC, and she is really looking forward, I think, to using the Spss data to increase efficiencies in reporting the statistics. And she'll be talking about how to get data out of Spss locally for each of the centers. And then finally is Randy Barber, who will be speaking. So Randy is the Spss Surveillance Coordinator for the C17 Council, who's located in Edmonton. And as the Surveillance Coordinator for the Spss program, he really is the single point of contact for all the principal investigators, the CRAs, the researchers, and other stakeholders. So Randy is ready and able to answer your questions with regards to Spss, and he'll be talking about some of the national data applications and some of the forms that you're required for you to fill out if you'd like to gain access to the data. So Randy's been working with the program for the last 6 years, so I would say, or hazard to say that he's the most knowledgeable about the program. So those are our 3 speakers for today, so I think we'll ask Emily to start.
Okay. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to present everything about the Spss CRF and data dictionary. So this presentation will give you an overview of what you can find in Spss, and it may help you find good ideas for research subjects. And I hope it will be interesting for you. So I will present you the Spss CRF section by section, and I will explain the advantage you can have in Spss for your project research. So maybe we can go on the first slide. Randy, do I change the number of this protocol? And oops, just go back to the slide. Yeah, thanks. If ever a patient has progressive and refractory disease, this is the only section where we can have actual information about how the patient is going. Because if he never reach remission, we will fill a different treatment plan every time there's a progression or no response to the treatment. So you can find multiple treatment plans here, but also if a patient relapses, we will fill out treatment plans every time. Next slide, section 6 and 7 is about the chemotherapy. So there's a very big list of agents that we can check off. And some agents will have details like anthracyclines, and we will enter date of first and last time it was administered. And just to note that if ever a patient receives, let's say, etoposide in a first-line therapy and for relapse, we will add on all the etoposide doses to the first treatment behavior. So you will have only one total for this agent. Next section is surgery details, which is, well, pretty obvious. We capture details about all the surgeries the patient will undergo. And some secondary surgeries are captured, but just to note too that central line insertion is not captured at all in the surgery details. slide is about radiation. So, well, we have all kinds of details about that, start and end date, the intent. The systemic therapy will be captured here, such as radioactive iodine. And again, it's general sites that are captured. So let's say the fibula is treated along with the primary site. We will capture abdomen flank left, for example, and limb lower left. So it's more general, and we capture details about the group also. Section 10 is about the transplant information, and we provide date of transplant, all kinds of information like type match and mismatch. If the patient has radiation, total body resistance, we will capture it here, and special chemotherapy details will be there. But some agents that are not listed here will be captured in the chemotherapy section. Next section, hospitalization, where you have dates that can be estimated here if ever patient is hospitalized elsewhere than the actual site. So sometimes we have missing information, but we do our best to estimate it the best we can. And we have the reasons for admission. So A is always all cancer-related and complication-related. C for transplant, and D if it's not related to cancer. And if ever we don't know, which is not often the case, we will choose D. And section 12 is about the complication. And we use the CTCA version according to the date of the diagnosis of the patient. So if it's before 2011, we use the version 3, and if it's after, we use the version 4. And there's a specific section for transplant complications related to the transplant. And relapse information in section 13, we only fill up this particular one if a complete response is achieved by the trial, and it includes date and metastasis. And if ever other treatments are given, we fill up sections that applies in this case. And that's about it. There's two other sections, section 14, which includes other therapies, like say laser therapies given for retinoblastoma, donor oocyte incision. And if ever non-conventional therapy is given, and we can see that in the charts, we will use this section. And this section provides you the date and cost of the test. So that's all the section we have in the data here. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Emily, for giving us an overview. I don't know if anyone has any questions specifically about the data elements that are available. Okay, well, not hearing any questions, we'll maybe move on to Stephanie, and Stephanie's going to talk to us again, as I said, a little bit about how to access the data, particularly if you're a local center, and some of the reporting statistics that are available through CYP-C.
Thanks. So I'll be talking about how to generate and export reports in EFIS. If you can go to the next slide, I'll just start with generating a report. So after you log in on Explorer, make sure you're on Explorer because it doesn't work in Chrome. You're going to click into the Reports tab and then choose which report you would like to generate. So there's a list of reports on the page, and those are what we're limited to at the moment. So just to let you guys know, we're working on a general data dump, but it's not ready yet. So for this example, I'm just going to choose annual statistics. And next slide. So this is what will show up, and there's parameters for each sort of report that you're going to generate, and you have to choose which parameters you want to know. So for this example, I'm just doing for the year 2016. And you can choose different diagnoses if that's what you want to find out. And then I choose Generate Data Dump Format in a single file. You can also do multiple files depending on what you want to do. And then you can't see it very well, but it says there's 3 buttons at the bottom there. One says Back, one says Reset, and the third one says Submit. And you're going to press the Submit button. Next slide. And this is what will show up. And it will look like there's no data in the report, and that's actually not true. So it opens up in a separate window, and I just want to say that there is a lag time between pressing Submit and that window opening. It'll open up and say it'll be blank for a little while, but it will actually load to this screen or a similar screen with some selected parameters on it. So just be patient with that loading. You know, go do something else for 5 minutes and come back, depending on how your system works. So make sure your pop-ups also are disabled on your browser to make sure that extra window opens. And to actually display the data part, you're going to have to go to the next page. So you just click on the little arrow, the blue arrow at the top, and you can see how many pages are in the report. For annual statistics, it's quite a long report, so you'll have about 8 pages or more, depending on your site. So then just click on that blue arrow. Next slide. And it will show you your report. So this is the first page of the annual statistics report, and yours will look similar for your site. There's a number of fields generated for the annual report, number of diagnoses for general groupings, so with, say, clumps of leukemias, the lymphomas, the solid tumors, and the CNS tumors together. And then there's primary diagnosis registered on a clinical trial for first treatment, number of relapses, number of deaths, number of hospitalizations, age at diagnosis, days from initial symptoms to diagnosis, days from diagnosis to treatment, duration of hospitalization. And then the other parts of the report actually are the same parameters, but broken down into the specific diagnoses. So between ALL, AML, they go into the specifics of each group. So there's quite a lot of data generated there. And if you see any discrepancies that you might find, you know, don't make sense, maybe just let Randy know, and he can sort of guide you on why that statistic might be. Okay, next page. So again, we're working on general CYP-C data dumps for site-specific data so that we own it. It's coming soon, but you have to work with your IT department closely, and it's between your IT department and Appasoft to generate a data dump for all of the CYP-C data. So it's not limited to those report parameters. So it just depends on your IT department's availability and prioritization of projects, and it will likely work in a similar manner to the generation and exporting of report data. All right, next slide. So any limitations of data, I just want to point this out. Before you're creating a data query or generating a report, just know the limits of the data. So you want to read through the CYP-C data dictionary very thoroughly to know how the data was collected and under what parameters and definitions, so that you can understand what the data report is truly capturing. And if you go to the next slide, I'll just give an example. So if you want to query time from diagnosis to treatment, for example, for the leukemias. So the only chemotherapy data collected under CYP-C is chemotherapy that requires collection of cumulative doses information. So, for example, anthracyclines. The general protocol therapy is only captured by the protocol name under the treatment plan. And this is important to know, so if you would like to query something from time from diagnosis to treatment start for leukemias, because generally this would be dictated by the time from initial diagnostic procedure, which would be the bone marrow LP, to the time of systemic chemo start. However, vincristine or steroid start dates are not collected by CYP-C, so you would need to use another parameter. Okay, next slide. Another example of this would be to know what is considered start of protocol treatment date for diagnosis. So the start of protocol treatment can also mean surgery for CYP-C purposes, which is not what, you know, for COG, for example, data collection, we wouldn't normally consider the surgery the start of protocol treatment date. We would consider the start of systemic chemotherapy instead. So just know what they're capturing as the protocol treatment start date. So know that it can be surgery or other diagnostic procedures that you may not consider to be the same as what you would think. So make sure you know your data dictionary before you start to do anything. All right, next slide. So when you're exporting the CYP-C report data, I'm just going to go through quickly this and to go to the next slide. So,
sorry, Stephanie, maybe we'll just get you to hold there for a second. I don't know who's hammering in their office, but if they could stop or put their phone on mute. Hello?
Hello?
Thank you. Okay, Stephanie, sorry.
That's okay. We're used to it here. We're under construction, so it's not me this time. Okay, so CYP-C selected parameters. So there's different types of files that you can export. And if you look at the top of the slide there, you'll see the page number sort of navigation, the zoom, and then select a format. And the select a format is what there's a drop-down menu that comes down. And unfortunately, when I was making these slides, my screenshot wasn't working. So this is what I had to PDF the page and screenshot it from that. So the drop-down, and then there's the little export button. So you're going to select from the drop-down the types of files to export. And these can be used for different purposes. So the XML file with report data is the first one. CSV, comma-delimited data is the next one. PDF file, HTML, which is a web archive type of file, Excel file, TIFF file, which is just graphics, Word, and then once you've selected one of those file types, you want to click Export, and it will download from that report. And I just want to point out here something very, it might seem obvious to people, but I think we forget sometimes, is that to save those files in a safe and secure location with a password for good clinical practice, especially if any patient identifiers are involved in the report, and even if it's just your stats, quite an important report. It is important to make sure that that's saved for your institutional guidelines and make sure that the data isn't going to get into anyone else's hands, and that shouldn't have them. So, okay, next slide. So once you've exported that file, you want to save it into one of those locations that's safe and secure. When you're importing it into other things to analyze the data, next slide, I can show you a couple things. I'm not a total expert in this yet, but I do know that these data can be imported into programs like Access and SPSS. So I'll go through the Access one first. There's a little tab within Access that says External Data, and then you can select the type of data that you want to import. So I would actually probably save your files as CSV or Excel type, because it would be easier then to import it into Access to be able to analyze the data in a more thorough manner. There's a few steps here. Obviously, there's little tutorials on these online, but it's actually quite intuitive to follow. So on the External Data tab, you would click Import and Link Group, and then select the type of file you want to import, and then follow the instructions in the Get External Data wizard. And next slide. So there's a bunch of different file types that you can import into Access, and just these are some of the ones, and it'll show you there's now Access apps versus desktop databases. So like desktop Access is what they're talking about there. The apps are on, I think, iPad and iPhone. So obviously, we'd probably be using the desktop one, which has more capabilities anyway. So there's a bunch of different file types that you can import into Access. All right, next slide. So SPSS Software is a statistics program that's user-friendly and that facilitates data management and statistical analyses, and it's free to use. So it can also perform highly complex data manipulation and analysis with simple instructions. And this software accepts also Excel or CSV data files that can be imported. So there's tutorials on importing data into SPSS, and there's also online tutorials that you can take part in as well. So I would encourage you, if you're using SPSS, I'm again not an expert in this one. I just know that we can do it. You know, I would either seek out help through your institution to use SPSS or try online to find a tutorial, because there's a lot of free info out there on SPSS actually, and that is really good for analyzing data. All right, I think that's my last slide. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Stephanie.
All right.
Any questions about the sites accessing their data directly? Okay, well that's great. We'll move on to Randy. So Randy is now going to walk us through the application process for actually accessing the national data. So Randy.
I'll unmute myself. So yeah, sites own their own data, so that's what Stephanie was addressing, and this is more all the data that goes up nationally, except for identifiers like name and healthcare number. So I'm going to talk about accessing this database. I'm going to focus on patient-level data for two reasons. One is that patient-level data is more stringent than aggregate, and two, that the aggregate data application is in need of revision. So there are three levels involved in reviewing an application. Approval from the CYP-C is the first step, and following that you'll receive a letter of next steps, which includes review by the Pediatric Oncology Group of Ontario, or POGO, and the Public Health Agency of Canada, or FAC. The next two steps actually begin in parallel to save time. And note that the applications are reviewed in the order they are received. So if accepted by the first of the month, they should be reviewed on that month's call, unless we're overwhelmed with applications, and then there may be a delay. And note that I say accepted because I perform an initial screening for omissions or glaring errors prior to acceptance. So step one is review by the CYP-C. The current management committee is also acting as the data access and use committee, but this may not always be the case. So if you look at the first bullet, you'll notice it is related to Lillian's talk last month on designing a good research question. So some of the specifics we'll be looking for will be overall study design, cohort to be included, paying attention to inclusion-exclusion criteria. We'll look for eligibility that includes specific diagnosis and time period, description of the control population if applicable. We look at endpoints, statistical analysis for all objectives, and sample size justification. So for the second bullet, I just mentioned our committee has gone back to nearly every applicant requesting better justification for data elements. So if you ask for an element, it should be mentioned in the methods and in the justification table. And any element that could be an indirect identifier will receive more scrutiny. So we don't want the approach depicted in our cartoon. And I don't know if you can read it, but it says, get all the information you can, we'll think of a use for it later. There are 2 points to the third bullet, and that's just that storage and protection of data is spelled out in the data use guidelines and in the application, so you just have to read it carefully and be sure you can follow what is spelled out. And finally, we have not received an application to link data sets yet, but I would expect it to receive a lot of scrutiny as well. Pediatric oncology is a small population in Canada, which increases the risks of re-identification of data. For example, a transplant database with patient name plus site and date of transplant could easily lead to identification of CYP-C patients without much effort. So moving on to the next step of the process. You may be wondering who POGO is and what is their role. So CYP-C is not actively collecting data in Ontario, but relies on a data sharing agreement with POGO for similar data they have collected in their Paganis database. Therefore, POGO has 15 business days to review applications and veto release of their data. Of special note, if you're looking for Ontario-only data, you should apply directly to POGO as we can't release it from CYP-C. So I put up this picture of Jason Pohl because he is part of POGO and on the CYP-C Management Committee, and we hope his presence will help head off any objections POGO may have before we send it to them. So far, POGO has agreed with our approvals, but that does not mean they will not reject an application or come back with additional questions of their own. One final note, as you'll see later, Pagano's and CYP-C data are not identical, and there are gaps between the two. So the remaining step of the review process is that performed by FAC. As data custodian, FAC has a lot of responsibility to safeguard the national data set. While FAC's privacy team is highly sophisticated with respect to matters of data privacy, they have no particular knowledge of pediatric oncology. Therefore, if you include a narrative explaining how each data element will be used, it will be most effective. Again, I stress that variables that are considered personal identifiers, particularly demographic variables, dates, and rare events, will receive the most scrutiny. So the reason we need to see your full REB application is to ensure you are only requesting elements that have been actually approved by your REB. FAC also needs to have signed copies of the Data Confidentiality Agreement and Form 82J they have of the Privacy Act. It overlaps somewhat with our application, but you can copy and paste methods as applicable. And finally, you'll also need to address any other issues that may arise. For example, research involving the Aboriginal community requires proof of engagement with that community. If and when everything is approved and in place, FAC will be in contact to arrange secure transfer of the data. So now, how do you actually apply? Well, first, you go to c17.ca, look under the Committees tab, and go to the CYP-C page. On the CYP-C page, you'll find all the necessary forms as well as other background material. You'll also find approved applications, not shown here, and I will ask all PIs if I can post the title of their approved application on our site once they receive data. So looking in the top section, you'll see the CYP-C Data Use and Publication Guidelines, which should be read prior to making an application. There's also a copy of the data abstraction forms to put the data elements in perspective. And finally, there are instructions to cover both aggregate and patient-level requests. So let's go through the patient-level requests. Here's some tips for a successful application. Read the instructions. You also need to consider who sees the patient-level data. So does a scientific collaborator really need to see the patient-level data? And regarding collaboration, multi-site collaboration is not a requirement, but it is strongly encouraged. When working with national data, you can only benefit by seeking input from researchers at centers outside of your own. Note that if you find the forms restrictive, you can add additional pages as necessary or supplement with a protocol. The last three bullets were mentioned earlier, but I just added them again here to stress their importance. Okay. So Appendix A of the application is an actual checklist of data elements you require. And a couple notes about this. In the upper section, you'll need to define the cases you request. So when requesting diagnosis, be as specific as possible. Do you want all diagnoses? Do you want only ALL diagnoses? Or do you only want ICD-10 morphology code 9826/3? And when requesting years, we have checked the 2001 to 2006 cohort for quality and completeness. And it is user beware if you're requesting more recent years. And you should also fill out the geographic regions or other criteria as necessary. So one major point is that the shaded elements are not available for Ontario patients. There are elements in CYP-C that POGO simply does not collect and vice versa. You'll notice a couple examples at the bottom of the slide. So those are elements that you just won't get Ontario data for. Secondly, you'll notice the option to request merged data or request CYP-C and POGO data separately. So some elements such as a child's sex or birth date are identical between the two data sets, easily merged. Other elements differed enough in format that either we could not merge them or we decided it was better for researchers to decide on how to best merge the data for their own use rather than us making a judgment call. So sometimes it may just be a matter that numbers were too low in one of the data sets. Another important detail is that potential indirect identifier have options for the amount of detail you require. So here, birth date and postal code, there are options. The more details you request, the stronger your justification will need to be. Again, this is a small population, and a full birth date and postal code could identify an individual in some cases. Add in a diagnosis and you have an even stronger identification potential. Appendix B of the application is used when you're requesting chemotherapy details. So again, on this form, grayed out areas indicate an element is not available. For each agent, CYP-C or POGO will capture whether it was administered or not, or they may actually capture the cumulative dose information. So for example, amifostine, you only get details on whether it was administered or not, and only for outside of Ontario. However, for bleomycin, you can request whether it was administered or not, or you can request the cumulative dose for all of Canada, including Ontario. So, in summary, your starting point is the C17 website. There are 3 levels of review to navigate successfully. Look for mentorship to help you put together a successful application. And you may contact me at any time with questions or if you need help. So I was going to finish by saying, don't forget to have fun with your research, and then putting up this quirky quote by Albert Einstein, which says play is the highest form of research. However, after doing some research, I discovered the quote should most likely be attributed to N.V. Scarf. So I'll just finish by saying to be careful when referencing other people's work. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Randy. So I think we'll open the floor for questions, if anyone has any questions.
Okay, I can add a couple things while people are thinking of questions. In Stephanie's presentation, the report she first demonstrated, I forget what it's called now, but that is not quite rolled out to all centers yet. It's under testing at BC, and we're hoping in the next week or so it'll be available at all centers.
Randy, how long does it generally take from the time I submit an application to the time I might expect to see data?
Tricky question. I think initially our first few were quite prolonged, but we've had one recently where it was, they had all their approvals in, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks. I don't know if they've actually received the data set yet, though.
Okay. So this is a process that takes sort of at best several months. Yeah.
I guess, well, let me step back. From when I received the application, it was probably 3 weeks to the first review by the management committee. And then after our review, it was, 4 or 5 weeks until all, POGO and FAC had both approved.
Okay, and then there's obviously some time to actually cut the data and disseminate it.
Cut the data and disseminate it.
Yeah.
And that's assuming there's not a lot of revisions required. We've had some where, after our initial review, they've had to come back in a month or 2 with their revisions.
Okay. Other questions about the data elements that are being collected, how you might access the data? Okay, so at this point I think we'll thank the 3 presenters for presenting today and basically describing how you can access the CYP-C data and what it is that actually is being collected. Again, we host this series once a month, and our next presentation will be held on April 14th when Elizabeth Ulrich will be talking about power searching. So Elizabeth is a librarian, and she'll be providing tips and tricks on how to actually search the literature to basically develop your background sections for any protocols that you might be submitting. So at this point, I guess I'd like to extend a thank you again to the 3 presenters and hopefully welcome everyone to the April 14th talk. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Okay,
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
don't know.